All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Grow Native Masterclass, Designing with, Maintaining, and Enjoying Native Shrubs of the Lower Midwest with Alan Branhagen. The Grow Native program is a native plant marketing and education program that serves the Lower Midwest, run by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I also want to recognize and thank our Grow Native sponsors listed here on the screen. Their support makes native plant educational opportunities like this one possible. During the presentation today, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen. At the end, I'll come back on and read those to Alan. This masterclass is being recorded. The private link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and the Q&A section. To introduce today's speaker, Alan Branhagen is the Director of Operations at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, where he supervises capital improvements, horticulture and natural resources, plant curation facilities, and information technology. For over 20 years, he was the Director of Horticulture at Powell Gardens, Kansas City's botanical garden. And prior to that, he had a nearly decade-long duty as Deputy Director of Resource Development for the Winnebago County Forest Preserve District in Rockford, Illinois. Alan Branhagen has studied landscape architecture in school, learned more through his work, and has published 3 native plant books: The Gardener's Butterfly Book, Native Plants of the Midwest, and the Midwest Native Plant Primer, which was just released this last summer. Beyond public garden management, Branhagen is an all-around plantsman and naturalist specializing in botany, birds, and butterflies, all the bees, and travels throughout the Midwest and the country visiting gardens and natural areas. So without further ado, take it away, Alan.
All right, thank you, Brooke, for that introduction, and welcome. I'm coming to you live from my office at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum up outside Minneapolis, Minnesota. But it's great to be talking to all my friends down in the lower Midwest, of course, where I lived for 21 years. And today we're going to talk about the native shrubs of the lower Midwest. And I hope everyone knows what a native shrub is, right? It's a woody plant that doesn't die back to the ground every year, and usually multi-stemmed. It can be anything from something that is kind of prostrate and covering the ground to growing up, some of them are 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 feet or more, but are often multi-trunked and not like a tree, which, with the identification being, a single stem and over 15 feet tall. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about today. And of course, the lower Midwest, has a really wonderful diversity of habitats. And this picture is from, let me see, it's in, and here I'm drawing a blank. I've been in Minnesota too long, but this is from just south of Sedalia, Paintbrush Prairie, an MDC prairie. And look at how inspiring that is, though it's all perennials, but there are native shrubs, of course, in our wonderful tallgrass prairie remnants. And here, obviously the lower Midwest has some of the finest stands of central hardwood forest on the planet. Obviously the Ozarks, probably some of the largest stands of that anywhere in the Midwest. And we have, of course, a great diversity of shrubs from those habitats. We have some wonderful savanna and glade habitats, which I think most people are familiar with, where you get the mix of the prairie plants, the woodland, and the scattered open trees. Most of these managed by fire. Of course, the diversity of wetlands in the Midwest is amazing. The picture of that savanna was actually Rocky Point Glade in Kansas City, and here's a wetland actually at Powell Gardens outside Kansas City. And of course, the Missouri River plays an important part of that in Mississippi. Lots of wonderful riparian habitats, which is another obviously important place for native shrubs. But I'm going to start off with, this is maybe kind of mean. Maurice Jennings was a really great architect who studied with E. Fay Jones under Frank Lloyd Wright, doing these really iconic earth-friendly landscapes. And this is the beautiful Hunt Chapel he did in Rogers, Arkansas. But we're talking about shrubs today. Look at the shrubs in that landscape. Evergreen, ever dwarf, ever fruitless, ever dull. And today we're going to talk about things that are not in that category. And oh, how I'd love to take this landscape and rip out the, looks like, lots of mandinas and hollies and other non-native things and make this alive and more organic with the beautiful architecture here. Sorry for the folks that manage this garden, but anyway, we have to show an example. And this is my front yard landscape. When I lived outside Kansas City, I called it Luna Ridge. I lived in Johnson County, Missouri. So we're going to talk about today more these earth-friendly, lively landscapes filled with native plants, and of course, all the web of life that is connected to them. So the insects and the birds, and the animals, and so and all that, all those creatures that you bring in by this kind of landscaping. And of course, here's my backyard to give you a little taste of really the styles. I like a little more natural style, and we'll talk mostly about that, though I will throw in some discussions about more traditional style landscapes as we go. But in terms of selecting shrubs for a landscape, I mean, like all plants, I always start with these three components. You know, the horticultural component: will that plant grow in the conditions you have? You know, its function in the landscape, what do you want it to do for you? And then of course, the icing on the cake, which you really should leave to last. Make sure, you know, it can grow where you want it and do what you want it to do, and then pick it for the aesthetics, that plant's beauty. And just reiterating how important going through these three steps whenever you're selecting plants. And you know, planting something that likes it dry in a wet area, or something that likes full sun in shade, those are just absolute horticultural requirements that you must follow. Lower Midwest, you know, you guys had a really, actually a worse cold snap than we did this past polar vortex. But I doubt any native plants were impacted by that. They're all adapted to pretty much all these mood swings we get. So no worries about hardiness of anything native. Um, and of course, you know, looking at where things grow in the wild tells you so much about how, you know, how they'll do in a landscape, how they function. And, you know, obviously, sometimes actually shrubs actually make good ground covers. Some of the ones that are spreading or suckering make good ground covers. One of their most important things is for defining spaces. And you know, we really don't use hedges anymore, but I think, you know, gardeners think of those as really defined spaces for like a front garden or any garden room outside. Green infrastructure, you know, I talked about the supporting the web of life, and another thing that we need to think about is edible landscapes. People are really utilizing more of what these things produce culinarily than they have in the past. So those are some of the functional things. And of course, the aesthetics are the, you know, ornamental attributes of the plants, which, you know, make sure that you think about all our senses in all the components of the plant. You know, the leaves and colors, fragrance, you know, taste, touch, but foliage really is probably the longest aspect on any plant, and something you really should consider first. Of course, flowers are that wow factor, especially with the early spring blooming things, and a lot of times the fruit is also very ornamental. So those are all the aesthetic components. So what we're going to do is just go through and talk about some of the lower Midwest native plants that I think are just phenomenal in gardens. And we're going to start out with the very few true evergreens that we have. And two species of yuccas I'll start with, both of them called soapweed. Yucca glauca on the left, which is a Great Plains native, in the lower Midwest native in a lot of Kansas, and only in the Less Bluffs in northwestern Missouri, but does really well across the whole lower Midwest. And Yucca arkansana on the right there, which is more of a Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains species further south. At one time, actually, they were thought to be the same species, but now we know they are different. But these are great evergreen. I mean, they actually do get a somewhat woody, you know, structural base that doesn't die back over time. So they really are shrubs. And of course, spectacular blooms in midsummer. And if you have yucca moths in your area, you know, they are pollinated only by the yucca moth, which actually physically takes the pollen and to the pistil and fertilizes each individual flower. Nothing else can do it unless you learn how to do it yourself. And then you get these spectacular candelabras and seed pods that mature over the summer and actually are pretty cool in the winter landscape as well. But the neat thing about this is if you have the hottest, driest, rockiest spot and you want some kind of low structural shrub, then this is a great choice for this. The picture on the left is actually from my old driveway right up by the street where the gravel was, or by the the road I lived off of. And what a great choice for there. These spires in the midsummer. Picture on the right is actually from Paul Gardens in one of the parking lot landscapes where again we had really harsh rocky conditions. These are great choices. I had to throw in the picture of this one you'll never cultivate, but mistletoe. If you live in the southernmost part of Missouri and Arkansas, the birds plant this, and of course it is an evergreen shrub that is a true parasite. But in low numbers and natural numbers, it really doesn't harm the trees, and of course is kind of beautiful in the winter landscape. And then the white berries, and everyone knows all the aspects of mistletoe, but it just had to throw that in. Another one of my absolute favorite evergreens is the giant cane, our native bamboo, which is native mostly in lower Missouri, southern Illinois, Arkansas, of course, southeastern Kansas. But this is a picture from my garden in Missouri where I planted it as a backdrop to my bird feeders. And what an exceptional habitat it creates in the winter landscape, a place for birds to fly in for protection from predators and protection from the elements. I think that's a great use of this plant. Any kind of shelter belt or screening or anywhere you're tempted to use one of the invasive non-native bamboos, please don't. Utilize this plant. And of course, at settlement, there were large stands of these, mostly in riparian areas in the lower part of the lower Midwest. And obviously, it has a lot of interesting creatures that are tied to it. I can think of like the Creole and southern pearly-eye butterflies. And I know there's a roadside skipper that only host on this plant. And sadly, one of our extinct species of birds, this was its habitat, the Bachman's warbler, which is extinct. And now the Swainson's warbler, also very uncommon, loves these dense thickets of this for its primary habitat. The one neat thing is when you bring it into a garden, and you can actually trim it to any size. And these are ones that at Powell Gardens used to, used to screen off a little parking area, and the gardeners actually pruned them off. And I know a lot of native plant advocates don't like, to do any shearing of any plant, but sometimes it does make a lot of sense. The only bad thing, of course, is it does run, and so you do have to control the rhizomes of this plant. It also does, unlike the Asian ones, it doesn't bloom and die. It does flower, and the seeds are actually edible, by the way. Going on to deciduous plants, I'm going to start off with some that we don't really think of in our gardens, and that is the rubises, the native blackberries and black raspberries and dewberries. And we really should consider them as naturalistic plantings on the edge of the woodland, or a more natural garden planted like on the sides. In my Missouri home, I had them planted along the edge of the woods on the edge of the lawn, which of course was actually pretty small lawn. Talk about edible landscape, great for songbirds and wildlife, and even the flowers of these are really, really nectar rich. And of course, I can't show all the different pictures. And in the winter landscape, the primocanes that will bloom the next year of black raspberry are absolutely exquisite violet. And letting them grow up into a thicket like that, I think is completely appropriate, but again, not so suitable for a traditional landscape unless you're growing it really as an edible, where you cut out the canes each year after they flower and produce fruit, and then you get new canes that will flower the next year. The blackberries are in that same group, but they have the really nasty cat claw-like thorns on them, can be really rough, but again, for wildlife habitat on the edge of a natural landscape, can't be beat. The fall color, it's kind of the lower half of this picture, are some native blackberries. I know I took this at Burr Oak Woods outside Kansas City and Blue Springs, Missouri, roughleaf dogwood as a backdrop to that. But and then the dewberries, which I really think we should do a little more research on those as being great ground covers. They're the ones that are prostrate, that just really don't have any structure and grow against the ground, but are woody stems, beautiful white flowers, and of course the edible fruits. So do consider these where appropriate, though I know a lot of them aren't generally available, unfortunately. Now here is a good shrub that does work in a traditional landscape because it stays as a simple kind of upright shrub, maybe 4 to 6 feet tall, sometimes a little taller than that, the black chokeberry. And you really grow it for its black fruits, which are also edible, though not, they'll make a little pucker face if you eat them. They do make really great preserves with a kind of a cherry-esque flavor, but pretty flowers, white flowers in the spring, great fall color, and again, stays put. The only thing is deer love this one, and so it can be challenging if you have a lot of deer in your landscape to protect it. Native just to a few isolated places in southeast Missouri, but does well throughout the entire South or lower Midwest. And wild roses, I just think they're so spectacular for their midsummer bloom. And we have several varieties native, and this is the Arkansas wild rose, which is really a low suckering species. There's a nice rose chafer beetle that would scare any rosarian, but of course in the wild I don't care, that they may chew up a few flowers, but big deal. And the other beautiful aspect of them, of course, are the hips in the fall, which all of them are edible, can be made into preserves, of course, very high in vitamin C, by the way. And the left, there is the Arkansas wild rose. The only warning on that one is it needs companions, as my notes say there. It really is a prairie native, and if you put it in a traditional landscape in really good soil, it just becomes this out of control wild thing, spreading all over the place. But if you have it planted with some sturdy perennial grasses or other sturdy perennials, you'll help it give it some competition and not be so out of control. On the right is the smooth wild rose, which is a much taller one, more in northeastern Missouri, but hardy across the lower Midwest as well. It's more pear-shaped fruits that start off orange and get ripened red, but it really doesn't have any thorns on it, which is one of the nicer aspects, though it does get fairly tall, more in the 5 to 6 foot range. The swamp milkweed, or swamp wild rose, if you have a wetland situation and really like wild roses, this one, native to southeastern Missouri and southern Illinois, in more wetland habitats. Actually, it's usually found really in more undisturbed habitats, which is kind of interesting, though it's fairly easy to grow. And I finally have ordered my first one for my new garden up here. I'm actually going to grow it in a container set in water. But for those kinds of wet situations, this rose can't be beat. And from my experience, does not run. It creates a big, a fountain in the, 5 to 6 foot tall range. And again, has the very similar to all the wild roses, the pink flower. And my favorite of the roses is the climbing wild rose, Rosa satigera, which actually could be used in a landscape just like any climbing rose. It gets these long running canes that really flower the next year, and blooming in midsummer, just always such an outstanding floral display, followed by really nice, probably the best display of rose hips of any of our native roses. And if you're like the habitat of multiflora rose, which of course is a horrible invasive, we are, eradicated or hopefully eradicated. This is, the native substitute. Use this plant for that kind of use. We also have some native azaleas. This one is Rhododendron viscosum, though I hate that name. I'm a splitter on this, swamp azalea, but really this should be the Texas azalea, Rhododendron oblongifolium. Not native in Missouri, but just south of Missouri in the Ozarks and southward into East Texas, but was actually the best azalea for us at Paul Gardens because it's extremely heat tolerant and has these beautiful white flowers in very late spring. Are great for attracting pollinating moths and have just a really sweet aroma. The other azalea, the rose shell azalea, Rhododendron pinophyllum. This is from my backyard in outside Kansas City, with really sweet, soft pink flowers and just incredible aroma as well. Usually when I think of seeing this, Hahn State Park comes to mind, southwest of St. Louis, where it grows wild. You smell it before you see it, and it just has this really nice permeating clove-like scent. Also pollinated by butterflies by day and moths by night. But the one warning on this, be sure in the lower Midwest that you buy Ozark sourced plants, because it is also native in the Northeast. And I did try to plant those in Kansas City, and it's too hot. And of course, those types do really well up here. And here is a picture when you do put, one in a cultivated setting where it doesn't have competition from other plants, they can be really exquisite. So this is the northern form here up at the Arboretum, but there's no reason why you couldn't have it looking like this in the lower Midwest as well. Missouri gooseberry. I think this is one of the most overlooked of our native shrubs, kind of common in woods that maybe were previously grazed, but still one of our first things to leaf out in spring and the last thing to have fall color, which is often very nice. And these sweet little flowers that are like little white shooting stars, buzz pollinated by bumblebees. And of course, it does produce an edible gooseberry, has that really rich gooseberry flavor when it's green. A lot of people like it that way. Some people let it ripen purple, and then it's sweeter in taste. But a wonderful understory plant for dry shaded woodland garden, just exceptional for that. And of course, the clove currant, also native, mostly in the Ozarks, barely getting into Missouri, but wrapping its range around to the west in Kansas. Ribes odoratum. There's a picture of its currant, which is also edible and actually quite good. Great fall color, but you really plant this for its clove-scented flowers, somewhat similar to the azalea I showed prior. And this is in my old front yard outside Kansas City when they're in bloom in the springtime. It had kind of a yellow theme of yellow flowering shrubs in that. They're kind of, I would say these are suitable for a traditional landscape. They do become kind of a little bit loose, and I don't know why we got this gumball idea that shrubs need to look that way, and hopefully we can start changing that people's tastes, but just an exceptional shrub, pretty tolerant of conditions from part shade all the way to full sun, and usually growing about 5 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet tall. So of course that can vary. Another woodland native is the Indian currant coralberry, and you can see the Latin name there. And it is really grown for its fruiting ability. It actually blooms in late summer. Oftentimes you don't even notice the little flowers kind of tucked under the leaves until you see a bumblebee pollinating it. But the fruiting, which holds into the winter, is just exceptional. And usually not many birds or eat it, but when it falls off or drops, they do eat the seeds out of the fruits, which I think is really interesting. And it is a host plant for the bumblebee clearwing sphinx moth, the day-flying sphinx moth. And this one would also make a great ground cover, and I think that's where we should use it more in design and landscapes, maybe for steep slopes where we want to control erosion and want, don't necessarily have to have a ground cover that's just 6 inches tall. This will, usually grows less than 4 feet tall, more in the 3-foot range. But it does sucker and make a full thicket. And when it's grown in full sun, this is actually in front of the chapel at Paul Gardens in the prairie there, it can be just stunning because it produces fruit so heavily in the full sun. Lead plant. Here is a native prairie shrub that is unique in that, prairies obviously have fires and so on, that it can actually bloom from the base on new wood. And, exquisite flowers. You can see they're really beautiful foliage. This thing grows on, dry to medium prairies, tough as nails. If you had that hell strip of a boulevard where you wanted a shrub with bright sun, very hot, dry, rocky, tough conditions, this is going to be a great one for you. And it's also easy to manage. It actually can grow about as much as 6 feet tall. But if you want to maintain it lower, you can cut it to whatever height, all the way down to the bottom if you want to each year. The mow, blow, and go crew that manages so many of our landscapes would do well with this one, and you'll get new flowers, which is phenomenal. I would love to see parking lot landscapes with this instead of Japanese spireas and some of the other junk that's put out there. Would be much more environmentally sound, and of course very, very tough. Let me see if I have another plant. No, I've got other amorphas. This one is not native to Missouri, though it probably was native to Northwest Missouri. It's just all the prairie there is gone. But native into Kansas and of course Western Iowa is the dwarf indigo bush, Amorpha nana, though it did really well in Kansas City. This one, unlike the lead plant, you cannot cut it back. It only blooms on old wood. But it does stay very small, only about 3 feet tall. Has these beautiful midsummer indigo flowers. And of course thrives in the hottest, driest, rockiest, awfulest place you can put it. And a lot of times we need some really neat structure for those kind of spaces. And this would, and again, that don't get too big. So that's why I still included that plant. The other, the third species, Amorpha fruticosa, the indigo bush, actually is native from floodplains and wetland edges all the way to dry. I've seen it growing on dry, rocky prairies. But this one becomes a very large shrub. And if you have the space, getting, a count on it being, more than 6 feet tall, 8 feet tall is actually pretty common. But those midsummer blooms are so cool. And, again, I wish this was interactive. We could talk about, what do you think about the fragrance on this? I do have colleagues from down in Missouri who love the aroma of this. It's kind of peanut buttery-ish, though not my favorite scent, but some people really like it. Turns a really pretty yellow usually in the fall. And again, here, these actually are from my Missouri landscape, and I kind of used it on the edge of the woods where we get a fair amount of sun. It does have to have at least half-day sun to flower, not a shaded plant. And hydrangeas, the wild hydrangeas. Here's a great shade plant because it is native in shaded woodlands, usually on areas with cliff faces or slopes. And these beautiful lace cap flowers on the upper left, and with all the fertile flowers in the center. That I should have a video attached to this showing how the bees just go crazy for these, collecting pollen. Those seed heads do stand into the winter landscape on the right picture. And on the lower left, of course, is one of the nativares of it, the Annabelle hydrangea, which, of course, we do want to shy away from those. That one has all sterile flowers, creating that big, well, not all, almost all sterile flowers. There actually are a few fertile flowers underneath there, but you are providing way less for pollinators. Of course, some of the other insects tied to this, like the hydrangea sphinx, doesn't care. But again, for the pollinators, you really want the native lace cap form of this. It says 4 to 6 feet, great for a shady landscape. And very showy when it blooms in midsummer, and then also in the winter time. And leatherwood, Dirca palustris, that's probably in bloom now down in the Ozarks. One of our first things to flower. Will be a couple more weeks for up here. But the sweet little yellow bells, the picture in the upper right shows it in full bloom, which is why it's not as popular as Forsythia. But let me tell you, this plant is way worth it. Don't ever waste space on a Forsythia when you can grow a leatherwood Very nice yellow fall color. I don't have pictures of the red berries, but it's one of the first shrubs to fruit in late spring. It's little red berries. Of course, it's actually attractive to a lot of mostly butterflies. And actually that picture on the left is from the western species, Dirca decipiens, which was discovered at the Overland Park Arboretum outside Kansas City, and named new to science from there, and now has been found in western Missouri and northeastern Arkansas as well. It blooms a little bit later. I don't think it's quite in cultivation yet, which is one neat thing about it. But the picture on the right, leatherwood is really a great plant for a traditional landscape where you want something that really stays in its place. Look at how it just has this wonderful uniform growth. It does get fairly large over time. Count on it being 8 feet tall at maturity or even more. And it's just really flexible. The bark, that's how it gets its name. Allegedly, native peoples used it as kind of a leather substitute. It's really pliable, which is pretty interesting. New Jersey tea, here's another shrub from the prairie that also blooms on new wood. So it's one, I'd love to see this more used in parking lot islands. It actually thrives in hot, dry, rocky sites and blooms in midsummer. It has a related species I didn't put in the program, and probably should have, called the red root, that blooms in spring. And it goes to seed when this one comes into flower. But New Jersey tea, another one, again, cut it off and at the end of winter, and it'll sprout back and bloom on new wood. And it also is very nice and tidy, that it only gets about 3 feet tall. So here's a picture of it, growing around the base of a post, and that's as big as it gets. And so again, for a traditional landscape, it is ideal. One of the reasons why we're not seeing more use of this New Jersey tea, and also very similar, the lead plant, acts very similar and likes the same habitats, is, they're just so very slow to start for the nursery industry. And people, we want our instant gratification. We don't want to wait 3 years for a tree or for a shrub to grow into its place. But let me tell you, it's worth the wait. And of course, talk about a sustainable plant that really, once established, needs no extra water, no extra care. They just can't be beat. The shrubby St. John's worts with their yellow flowers. Here, a shrub at Powell Gardens on the left. The right one is actually from here at the Minnesota. But I'll go on to the actual close-ups of the flowers, but blooming for a fairly long period of time in midsummer with bushy stamens that all kinds of pollen collecting bees just go berserk for. And that's kind of the fun part of it, is they're just alive with bees busy crawling all over them, trying to grab as much pollen as they can to their pollen baskets. It's pretty cool. The fall color on these is actually pretty good as well. And then they get these little brownish seed capsules that hold on into the winter landscape. The only thing on this species is it does seed itself a lot. Hypericum prolificum, it is prolific, but it's not that hard to me to remove it. It actually is quite suitable to a traditional landscape, keeping this pretty tight form. The only thing is it's sort of short-lived, and over time you can get some pretty interesting shaped, gnarly plants, but the stems on them also become like polished mahogany, these beautiful kind of exfoliating polished stems, really neat. Nine bark, Physocarpus opulifolius in the rose family. Kind of a late spring bloomer, great for a lot of pollinators and a lot of butterflies, red admirals, when they start really migrating back north or coming out of hibernation in the lower Midwest. You're lucky that they probably can do that down there, but great for butterflies. And then the flowers do produce the seed capsules. The lower left picture shows them as they start to ripen, which is another neat ornamental attribute of this shrub. They start out sage green and then can often go to pink, and then of course brown, and then they hang to me, quite ornamental in the winter landscape as well. The biggest mistake about ninebark is that it becomes large, and that's what I see in terms of landscaping, is you don't realize that it becomes a massive giant fountain shrub, and so do plan for that. Pretty much everything in the nurseries right now on this are the colored foliage varieties. It's just extremely popular. Amber Jubilee is one that has kind of ambery flowers that turn, or foliage that turns purplish, and of course Diabolo is was kind of the classic one that has this purple foliage. But of course, we want to try to promote the native species of this with its green foliage and abundant bloom and seed. And of course, all of them, the picture on the lower part there, have phenomenal fall color. In my native plants of the Midwest book, I actually put this in the small tree, large shrub category. Really hit home that, you know, this plant's going to get 8 feet tall, and I've seen them as tall as 12 feet tall. So when you are utilizing them, keep that in mind. So kind of back of the border, great, you know, defining a backyard as a big natural type edge. The one thing is they don't seed themselves around and they don't sucker. So that's a good thing. And their stems are a good thing in a traditional landscape. And their stems do exfoliate and are quite interesting. And the name, I know I've had, going back to that, has a couple meanings that I've never really researched what's true, that the bark curls into the shape of a 9, or it had 9 different uses by the native peoples. I don't know what the heck answer is on that. American hazelnut, another savanna species of shrub that also becomes quite large over time, but can thicket up and sucker up. But it has great fall color. I planted more of this plant than any other shrub at my Missouri landscape, because the old flora books of Kansas City talk about it being the most common shrub in that area, which is pretty amazing because it's not so common anymore. It has those neat catkins on the left there, which are just now blooming up here, so I'm sure they're passed down there. The picture on the upper right is actually the female flower, which looks like a little, you know, reddish fuchsia spider coming out of a bud. But those, of course, if pollinated by the wind from those tall, the lanky male catkins on the left there, you will produce the hazelnut, which is actually also quite ornamental as it matures through the summer, because it's in this really interesting sage green husk that does, of course, ripen brown, and inside there is the nut if you can beat the squirrels to it. And it's amazing how these are really growing in popularity, kind of in agroforestry and, you know, edible landscapes. And here at our gift shop, we sell, you know, Native American hazelnut oil, cooking oil. It's become really popular, but just a great plant ornamentally as well. But again, better for more of a natural landscape or kind of edge of a formal landscape where you can create kind of a thicket with it. But boy, is it, you know, it has subtle beauty until the fall, when it really does put on a show with some of the best fall colors that you can have in the lower Midwest. American bladdernut, if you have a woodland or shady garden, this is, again, a very large shrub, as I say, 8 to 12 feet. Native throughout the whole Midwest, very, very drought tolerant once established. The picture on the left there actually is taken here, but it, you know, could be, you know, anywhere all the way into Arkansas. These are perfectly fine. Have these white pendant flowers. Some people kind of think they're like the silver bell, which is not locally native, and does attract interest. You know, this one does attract several species of pollinators. But for a shade garden, just can't be beat. And this will go, the reason it's called, bladdernut is because it produces these really cool fruits that are inflated like that. And I actually think they're pretty cool. Those light, usually light green, contrasting to the darker foliage in summer. They ripen brown, and then the seeds rattle around inside there and will hang in there through the winter. Native peoples did use them as baby rattles, and I think that's kind of fun. It's also reported that the seeds are edible and you can pop them like popcorn, but I've never been successful to get them to do that. So sometimes I wonder about some of those stories. I have eaten them though, and I'm still here, so they must be edible. Buttonbush, here's a plant native to wetland edges and riparian habitats, but is just a phenomenal, again, very large shrub. You could almost treat it as a small tree. These are taken on the island garden at Paul Gardens, but very clean, sharp foliage, no suckering, so really good for a traditional landscape like our island garden, which is kind of a formal setting. You can see the beautiful glossy green foliage through the summer, really, really heat tolerant and actually drought tolerant. It doesn't necessarily have to be planted in a wetland or riparian habitat, but it's summertime flowers. Look at that. I mean, when we first put those in at Paul Gardens, everyone was like, well, where did this come from? And of course, you know, you're like, well, we grew these from seed from along the Missouri River. You know, it's a locally native species. And really great for pollinators. A lot of our larger butterflies, the swallowtails, here's a bumblebee. Isn't that a funky, wonderful flower though? And then those do produce brown seed heads into the winter that kind of shed, and a lot of things like wood ducks will eat those. And of course, I put in way too many shrubs here to talk about. We'll have to keep moving fast. Here's the American elderberry, Sambucus canadensis. Midsummer bloom, blooming in the same time as the climbing prairie rose that I showed earlier, Rosa satidra. They actually make really cool companions. I should put a companion shot in this. These are loved in Europe in gardens because of that beautiful lace cap midsummer bloom, and why we don't here is really unfortunate. The one thing is, it is a highly variable shrub, and I don't know how to even explain that. Sometimes you get one, you grow one, and it suckers all over. Sometimes they don't. And, you know, that's why I can see why people want to select cultivars of these things. But I had to just show this. Watching these bloom through the summer, I just think, you know, they're just like a sea of pearls in bud, and the flower is gorgeous. And, you know, the fruits are, of course, edible. And unfortunately, I've heard in Missouri, because of the spot-winged Drosophila, really kind of wrecked the fruit industry of that there, which is unfortunate, that imported pest. But even after the berries are stripped, I love, you know, the racemes of the flower stalks left there, and they're, you know, magenta. How cool is this? And from Northeast Missouri, but doing well all the way through the lower Midwest, we had great success growing this in Kansas City, is the red-berried elder. It blooms in springtime. It would probably be blooming down there right now. Has these interesting creamy white flowers, followed by red fruits in midsummer that are just stunning and just relished by songbirds. This is also about an 8-foot tall shrub. It does not get as kind of crazy as the American elderberry, the one I showed prior. It doesn't really seem to sucker, so it becomes just a big, large, fountainy shrub. And as companion plants, the two species of elderberries are actually pretty fun to put together, because when the one has the beautiful red berries, the other has the white flowers. And this is actually a picture from up here, but and where we've used them on the edge of a woods as a planting. And again, that would be a great way to use them in a garden, kind of understory, edge of the woods, in a, you know, a shrub bed that's off to the side. I think they work really nicely. Rough leaf dogwood, Cornus drumundii, very common in the Kansas City area. I know it's not so common in parts of the Ozarks, but still a tremendous shrub. And probably, if I had to say, of all the things I've talked about, this is the absolute #1 for songbirds. It's a thicket forming, suckering shrub, but give it, you know, maybe planted in the row, again on the edge of a yard or landscape, on the edge of a woods, and kind of just let it go. White flowers in early summer, followed by in fall those white berries on those red pedicels. Very shocking, but just a a real advertisement to all kinds of birds to eat it and spread its seeds. And of course, it is very, very high in fats and timed perfectly for songbird migration. And I often, when my edges of my woods were filled with those, I'd pull up a chair and my binoculars and just be amazed by all the diversity of birds I had, including a lot of warblers and even things like eastern wood peewees. I saw a flycatcher that you don't normally think of eating berries, eating those. This is actually near the entrance to my former garden in Missouri, where the picture on the right, where I had a kind of a mass of it near the entrance driveway. And of course, fall color on that plant is also really good, getting these great purplish tones. Another dogwood, Cornus amomum, the silky dogwood, which can have kind of reddish stems. I don't recommend the red osier dogwood in the lower Midwest at all. So that's kind of the red twig dogwood. Use this as a better plant that, of course, is native throughout the whole Midwest. White flowers. And of course, its fruits are so beautiful, those kind of porcelain colors of blue, and also are very high in fats. So these do not hang on the plant that long because the birds just strip them off and eat them. But this shrub is more of a big fountain type shrub, about 8 feet tall. So again, you've got to give it a lot of room and space. And we actually did select one of the native plants at Paul Gardens, which is in the trade, called Red Rover, a selection of this with actually very nice red stems, but obviously growing the straight species. And I should mention on dogwoods, you can never have just one. You do have to have 2 different selections or seedlings so that they cross-pollinate and produce fruit. The spice bush, Lindera benzoin, here's another great woodland native plant with the small flowers that are probably actually past peak in the Ozarks now, blooming very early before the leaves come out, and then in fall, those red berries on the female plants. So you have to have both male and female plants. This also becomes a very, very large shrub, so do plan on it eventually getting 8 feet tall or more over time. Here's a picture of I had it planted just beyond my back fence against the woodland, and it's just starting to grow up over the fence. Nice little myrtle yellow-rumped warbler there sitting on the fence, if you didn't notice that. This is also a host plant for the spicebush swallowtail and the Promethean moth. If you live more in eastern Missouri and Arkansas, you'll get that wonderful moth. But again, you have to have both male and female. And this is one of those plants where you get it from is really important. I don't know how many of these plants I had die in Kansas City until I grew, ones grown from, well, I actually collected seeds, in the Ozarks and bought them from Lake Missouri Wildflower Nursery. And those did really well for us. But otherwise, it can be really fickle. So do try to get a local source, really critical on spicebush. And fragrant sumac, one of my favorites for early nectar production. Those yellow flowers in the upper left there before it leaves out in spring. Midsummer has those really beautiful red fruits, which actually can be used culinarily. And fall color on this plant is really exquisite. It's a highly variable plant, and I just got the new Trees and Shrubs and Woody Vines of Arkansas book, and they try to make some sense of the different varieties. And sometimes it's like, what I'm seeing in the wild doesn't fit any of those. So do kind of look at the plant you're getting. Unfortunately, the cultivar Grollo is what most of the nurseries carry, which is a variety from the Great Lakes, and really not. I actually don't like it in the lower Midwest. It never looks like it's happy. It doesn't fall color as well. So do try to use the local strains of this. These are all pictures from my Missouri garden. Just one of my favorites. And right now, I know these are blooming because I've seen Facebook posts from some of my friends down in Missouri that the tall prairie willow. Willows are one of these things that we cannot forget. And here I know I'm at my time limit, but those really pretty, the prairie willow does have the typical pussy willow catkins in early spring that open up to flowers. This is actually the male. They are male or female. Males have the pollen-rich catkins, and the females they're actually nectar-rich. These are pollinated by insects, and they are just swarming with them, by the way. One of the best things you can plant. The prairie willow is our really only upland willow, so will do well in almost any landscape. I've got more pictures of it. These are from Paul Gardens, where we planted a thicket of them to hide a parking lot. Beautiful gray-green foliage, yellow fall color. It actually can become quite a large shrub, 8 feet tall or more, but this is another one that can be cut back. And but we'd cut them back early so that they get growth for the spring bloom again. It is the host for the viceroy butterfly, the monarch mimic, but very limited, so that viceroys really don't like the hairy, silky leaves on this one. And I very rarely find a viceroy caterpillar. In fact, the ones in my garden have only once had one viceroy on it, where they like the other species of willows actually better. But still, as a landscape plant, this one is the premier willow to grow in the lower Midwest. Vernal witch hazel, that's blooming up here right now, and I'm sure long since done. It blooms in winter more in the Ozarks and attracts winter flying noctuid moths, which I think is kind of cool, and of course emits that really nice fragrance that we get to enjoy from that. The flowers are so variable. This is one, if I would love to, go to Missouri Wildflowers Nursery and when they're in bloom in the spring and pick out a variety of bloom colors, yellow to red. It actually also gets very large, and over time, the picture on the right actually is taken here. We have one shrub that's 20 feet tall, but it is multi-trunked shrub. And the picture on the lower left is actually from the Dawes Arboretum. When I was there a couple of years ago, they were showing me one that they grew from the Ozarks. Actually, I think they got seed from the Shaw Nature Reserve that stayed really compact that they like. So highly variable, but for early spring bloom can't be beat. This is actually here looking out at our vernal witch hazel in the wintertime. So I like it planted in a landscape where because it blooms in the winter and where light passes through the flowers to where you're sitting, because the light, the backlighting of it actually makes the flowers showcase a little better, which is kind of interesting. Viburnum dentatum, the arrowwood viburnum, white flowers that are actually kind of stinky. But this is also another fairly large shrub, easily getting 5 feet tall, but you really grow it for its fruits, which are also really rich in fats and great for migrating songbirds. The flycatcher, the eastern kingbird, this is one of its favorite things to fatten up before it leaves for South America in the fall. And the fall color on these can be just, especially in the shady landscape, can be these really odd pink colors. And I know this shrub is only native in one county in Missouri, but it's more widespread in Illinois and wrapping around in Arkansas. But this really, to me, is the best species for wildlife. None of the other ones really have these fat-rich berries in the fall that are so good for songbirds. And I believe I'm on my last one, Brooke. So prickly ash. People would say, why would you include that? I just think it's such an underappreciated shrub that does deserve a space in the landscape, but you got to let it do what it wants to do. And it would make a really nice kind of barrier planting on the edge of the landscape where you can let it thicken up. And of course, it has those thorns. It's also another one that's male and female. Flowers are subtle yellow in the spring before the leaves, but are really neat. And then the fruits, to me, are so cool on the female plants in summer, like little red Pac-Mans. They open up with the black seed in them. And of course, you can use them a little bit as a pepper substitute, Szechuan pepper, but they have a numbing effect to them. So toothache tree is another name for this. And here's a picture of an edge planting of them on female plants with in red berries in summer. And of course the picture, if you love the giant swallowtail, this is its preferred host plant, and that's the caterpillar there that looks like a bird dropping. So anyway, I know I raced through these, but it's 4:55, so we need to take some questions, Brooke.
Thank you, Alan. Oh, that was fantastic. I know I took lots of great notes, and I'm sure the rest of the participants have too. So thank you so much for all this great information. We do have a number of questions. So I'll get started with those. First one that came through, someone was asking if the birds eat the chokeberries since they stay on through the winter.
You know, they very rarely do. I think it's more mammals that actually will eat those. And, you know, it is one of those, yeah, oftentimes in nature, yeah, in late winter, they're still there. And I really just haven't seen them used that much by songbirds, I'll be honest.
Good to know. Good to know. Someone was asking if native plants are deer resistant. All of them aren't, but are there certain ones that you found might be deer resistant?
Yeah, I know that's always a tough question. And of course, I actually want us all to plant what we like, and then of course do whatever we can to deter and fence out the deer and, you know, support NDC and controlling populations and et cetera like that. But well, let me see. Well, the spice bush is one of those that's pretty resistant though, in heavy, you know, areas with heavy deer, there might be some spring browse on them. This prickly ash right here is another one that deer don't really like. Let me see, what are the ones? I mean, they don't really like the prairie willow, for me anyway. They do go after the elderberries. Of course, they're not going to mess with yuccas on the first one or the giant cane that I showed. They love the viburnums. I'm just drawing a blank on, you know, the first one that comes to mind is spice bush, that they really, really don't care for that one.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Someone is asking if black chokeberries ever get mature enough that you don't have to protect them from deer.
Nope, the deer will be able to always reach them. So if you don't, you know, don't have them fenced, and you have high deer population, yeah, they're going to be browsed.
Thank you. Someone was asking here, you touched a little bit on some of the species that you do need to have a male and female plant. They're asking if all of the fruit producing, nut and berry producing plants like serviceberry, elderberry, hazelnut, do you need more than one of each shrub to get the fruit? Or is there value in just one shrub?
It depends. That's why you need to buy my book, because things like the serviceberries are and hawthorns are, you know, they're apomictic. They don't even need to be cross-pollinated and they'll produce a fruit. So it's really complicated. Things like plums, you know, have to have cross-pollination, and the viburnums have to have cross-pollination to set fruit. And then, yeah, some of them are male and female, like the prickly ash and the spice bush. And so it you know, you really have to, and even things like perennial strawberries are male or female. A lot of people don't know that. So I do try to, I think I covered that pretty well in my book. And so, yeah, there's no blanket statement on it. You have to look at each species.
Great. Thank you. And good plug for your book. Whenever I email tomorrow out the recording of this presentation, I'll link both of those books. We have them available in our Grow Native store. And if you liked the intro today, you can learn even more from those books. So another question, we had a number of questions about pruning. I see they started popping up when folks were asking, when is it best to prune 9 bark? And does 9 bark bloom on old or new wood? What's your recommendation on pruning that?
Yeah, 9 bark blooms on old wood. So that's one, yeah, you prune it after it flowers. So you get that good growth to flower the next year. So that's the pruning type on that one. You know, I know I talked about like lead plant New Jersey tea. When they're dormant, you can prune them all the way to the ground or wherever you want to, and you know, they'll still grow and bloom on new wood. So yeah, some of that, you know, really depends on, you know, when it blooms and if it's on new or old wood.
Okay, because there are a number of questions just generally about when to prune natives. So it sounds like it's pretty specific on.
There's no blanket statement again. The wild hydrangea is another one like the lead plant. You could actually cut your wild hydrangea in the, you know, before it leaves out in spring all the way to the ground, and we'll get new shoots that will flower on new wood. But that usually is the exception. So for the most part, you know, blooming right after or pruning right after flowering is a fairly good rule of thumb.
Good to know. When you were showing those this beautiful pictures of buttonbush. Someone asked, can you coax buttonbush into an upland garden?
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
A lot of our riparian species of plants actually are drought tolerant, because when they are under floodwater, it's like a physiological drought. And so they are well adapted to those kind of conditions. And I know several friends of mine have button bushes in their upland landscapes doing just beautifully.
All right, here's a question about a difficult place to get some plants to grow every once in a while. Do you have any shrubs you would recommend under a black walnut tree?
Actually, most of the native woodland ones I talked about, and in fact, I think all of them are adapted. It's amazing. The issues with black walnuts are really more like non-native vegetables. Like don't try to grow tomatoes under there, but virtually all of our native woodland flora, all of our pre-vernal spring flora, and things like the spice bush and stuff are completely fine under a walnut.
Okay, thank you. With that prickly ash, you were talking about what it's a host plant for, but what eats the berries on that prickly ash?
That's a really good question. I've never really noticed what eats them. And some of these, it's like, and I hate to say unless I've seen it myself. And that's I think the first time I've ever gotten that question. I'll be honest. And they when they start to ripen, actually before they ripen, when I'm on hikes and walk by them, I love to just grab a few, and they are in the citrus family, so the oil, just like a, orange peel. And I just love to, smell them and, that kind of thing. But yeah, virtually, yeah, other than the giant swallowtail as a host plant, I don't know. And probably the fallen seeds, you often see songbirds scratching around underneath this. I wonder if things like white-throated sparrows and fox sparrows and towhees and things like that are actually eating the seeds that drop out of those fruits. I bet that's the case.
Okay, good to know. It sounds like we need to plant some prickly ash, everyone here, and we can all observe it.
Well,
and learn that way too.
I've got it started at my new place.
Fantastic.
Native. I got rid of the buckthorn and some came up, and so now I'm starting it.
Great. Well, someone here is asking, and this is a good question, how do you know if you're getting male and female plants?
Well, you have to turn over the leaf and look. No, you have to wait for it to flower. And so that can be really challenging. You don't know if you're buying the seedling, but yeah, if you can buy a plant in flower and look, does it have stamens with pollen, or is it the flower pistillate? That's the way you have to tell. So, and I've often thought of that. I would love it if native plant nurseries would, on their bigger stock, maybe on things that are dioecious like that, label them, this is a male and that's a female. But I think that, staff will help you on things like that if you have that specific question.
Okay, thank you. Someone here asked if you can transplant coralberry easily.
Yes, it moves real easily. Yeah, you can best to bare root it after the leaves drop anywhere, through when the soil is diggable, and the same thing in spring before it leaves out is the best time. I have moved it before, no problem whatsoever.
Good deal. I do see a number of questions where folks are asking about where to buy specific shrubs or where to buy native plants in general. And I'll just mention that I'll send out our Grow Native resource guide tomorrow. We have many different native plant businesses listed, so all over the lower Midwest, where you can find some local, either a local place with a retail front, or many places will ship plants to you. But I'll send that information out tomorrow, since there's quite a few questions about that here in the Q&A.
I love
I
your
also
resource guide.
Go ahead.
I said I love your resource guide. It's phenomenal. Thank you, Grow Native, for doing that.
Yes, I'm glad you like it. It's a great resource for anyone trying to find any native plant related businesses. I do have a number of questions here about your first slide, the giant cane, and people were asking about how aggressive it could be. I know you mentioned you can trim it back, but how much how much work is someone going to need to put in if they want to plant that in their yard?
Well, it's not as bad as an Asian bamboo, but it does run. So for me, just every spring go around with a shovel and cut off any of the runners you see. But yeah, there's no such thing as no maintenance, as you know. But also, if it's planted in an area where there's some kind of barriers for its roots, that also helps. But I just prefer to you just spend the time cutting off those runners where you don't want them.
Thank you. Oh, here's someone asked if it's possible to sprout or transplant cuttings from spice bushes.
I don't think so. I think it's a really tough to root one. It's actually pretty easy to grow from seed, and that would be the best way to grow that plant. And it doesn't really sucker, so yeah, you're gonna have to grow it from seed.
Okay, thank you. Someone is asking about currant plants, clove currant. Are those a host for cedar apple rust?
I don't believe so. No, I'm thinking more up here. The white pine blister rust is some of the ribes, but no, not cedar apple rust.
Okay, thank you. I do see a number of questions here where folks are asking where they might be listing out their specific. I have medium sun, dry soil, etc. What shrub would be best? And another link I'll share tomorrow is our searchable Grow Native database.
Yes.
There's over 300 plants listed there, and you can select what your needs are, whether that's full sun, dry soil, if you want wildlife benefit, if you want specific colors, if you're designing. So I'll send that link out tomorrow. That'll be a good resource for some of these very specific questions that we might not have time to address.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, obviously I showed for the really tough conditions, those, yuccas, lead plant, New Jersey tea, hot and dry, but anyway, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Oh, can prairie willow be pruned to maintain a certain size?
Yes, and that's what we did there on those plantings at Paul Gardens, is we would cut it off again after it blooms. You want it to flower so that you help all those beneficial insects in the spring, and then after that you can really cut it to any height you want to, and it grows back robustly from that point, and then of course we'll bloom the next spring on that wood.
Okay, someone's asking here about what's a shrub that's a good traditional looking for a front yard if they needed a more formal looking garden, maybe because of their HOA rules or something.
I mean, I touched on some of those. To me, actually, for whatever reason, yuccas do meet that standard. The lead plant and the dwarf indigo bush also really meet that standard. Yeah, chokeberries are usually acceptable. The native azaleas, but again, I didn't really get into that. You have to have, really well-drained organic soil for them with good amounts of compost, and of course, they usually prefer the acidic side, and they are really good traditional shrubs. Vernal witch hazel, and nine bark. Very much so, but just you got to remember that they get large, but they are suitable for traditional landscapes. And arrowwood viburnum is another one that's very actually quite common nativars of it in the nursery trade that get utilized.
Great, thank you. Here someone's asking about the difference between clove currant and golden currant.
Well, they're really the same thing. There is a Ribes auratum from further west, and I actually don't know if they lumped them or split them yet. I usually, Ribes auratum, get the Midwestern form.
Okay, that's good to know. All right. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Some of these questions, again, I think will be able to be answered with some of these resources I'll send tomorrow, some of those specifics about what they want in their site, or some specifics on a specific plant. But Alan, thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. There's many notes in the chat and in the Q&A where folks are thanking you for your time and your great presentation. And I see fantastic information. I definitely want the book. So you have some fans here from the Grow Native side. So thank you for this presentation. It was fantastic. Any parting words for the group?
Well, I'm glad people enjoyed it, and I know I did a lot, but the resources of the native plants of the lower Midwest are phenomenal, and please go out and seek them out, and you'll be amazed how they will enrich your life.
Yes, thank you, Alan. And everyone, again, I'll send that email tomorrow with the recording to the presentation, links to more information, and I'll send out information. We have some plant sales coming up this spring, even one in Jefferson City this weekend if you're in mid-Missouri and want to pick up some native plants and get a head start on introducing some new shrubs to your landscape. So thank you again, Alan, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and we'll see you on another webinar soon, I hope.
All right, take care all.
Thanks for joining us, Alan. Have a good evening.
Good night.